Congressman Kucinich from Ohio.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I don't think the question facing us today, with all due respect to my friend from California, is whether or not this is a moment for Monday morning quarterbacks. The question is whether taxpayers should have purchased the Bank of America franchise. Now, with Mr. Paulson's testimony today, it's an undisputed fact that then Secretary Paulson told Bank of America's Ken Lewis that the government might remove him and his board of directors if Bank of America abandoned its deal to acquire Merrill Lynch. It requires a judgment call to decide if Secretary Paulson was being justifiably tough in response to Bank of America's consideration of invoking the material adverse change clause in its merger contract, an arguably unwise but lawful action, which he viewed as a potential threat to the financial system at a moment of crisis. But nothing in Secretary Paulson's testimony today justifies the government's decision to ignore evidence that Bank of America withheld information from its shareholders about mounting losses at Merrill Lynch before the crucial shareholder vote on December 5th, a potentially illegal act. I've seen no justification for the government to override recommendations of professional staff at the Fed and the president of a regional Federal Reserve Bank for greater accountability of Bank of America's top executives. Yet, sadly, that is precisely what Mr. Paulson and Mr. Bernanke did. This committee's investigation and two previous hearings have revealed that the government had concluded that Mr. Lewis's management of Bank of America was seriously deficient and possibly in legal jeopardy. Top staff at the Fed and Treasury had determined that Mr. Lewis knew about accelerating losses at Merrill Lynch before the shareholder vote to ratify the merger, but he did not provide that information to shareholders. The top lawyer at the Fed had determined that Mr. Lewis and his management team were possibly in violation of securities laws for withholding material information from shareholders. Top professional staff at the Fed had determined that Mr. Lewis and his management team had failed to do due diligence in acquiring Merrill Lynch and were not up to the task of identifying and solving the problems in which they found themselves in late 2008. Top staff at the Fed and even the president of a regional Federal Reserve Bank were pressing for a number of new requirements on Bank of America as conditions of any federal bailout in order to remedy the deficient management they perceived. If you look at the screen, appreciate if staff would put that up, you will see the supporting documents our investigation has revealed. In an email from a senior advisor at the Federal Reserve to Chairman Bernanke, quote, "There are clear signs in the data we have that the deterioration at Merrill Lynch has been observably underway over the entire quarter, albeit picking up significantly around mid-November," unquote. Next slide, please. From a restricted Federal Reserve analysis of Bank of America Merrill Lynch merger, quote, "BAC management's contention that the severity of MER's losses only came to light is problematic and implies substantial deficiency in the diligence carried out in advance of and subsequent to the acquisition. These were clearly shown in Merrill Lynch's internal risk management reports that BAC reviewed during their due diligence." Next slide, please. The potential for losses and other risk exposures cited by management, including those coming from leveraged loans and the trading in complex structured credit derivatives. That's derivatives products, that's called correlation trading, should also have been reasonably well understood, particularly at BAC itself is also active in both these products. Next slide, please. From an email from the Fed's General Counsel to Chairman Bernanke, Lewis should have been aware of the problems at Merrill Lynch earlier, because as early as mid-November and not caught by surprise. That could cause other problems for him around the disclosures Bank of America made for the shareholder vote, unquote. Next slide, please. From another email from the Fed's General Counsel to Chairman Bernanke. A different question, quote, "A different question that doesn't seem to be the one Lewis is focused on is related to disclosure. Management may be exposed if it doesn't properly disclose information that is material to investors. His potential liability here will be whether he knew, or reasonably should have known, the magnitude of the Merrill Lynch losses when Bank of America made its disclosures to get the shareholder vote on the Merrill Lynch deal in early November, unquote. Next slide, please. In early December. To get the shareholder vote on the Merrill Lynch deal in early December, unquote. Next slide, please. From talking points prepared by top staff at the Federal Reserve, quote, Bank of America should expect to be required to more intrusive review and involvement by the U.S. government in the selection of management of Bank of America, including the Board of Directors, unquote. And the final slide. From an email from Eric Rosengren, President of the Boston Federal Reserve Bank, to Chairman Bernanke, quote, going forward, I'm concerned if we too quickly move to a ring-fenced strategy, particularly if we believe that existing management is a significant source of the problem and that they do not have a good grasp of the extent of their problems and appropriate strategies to resolve them. I think it's instructive to look at the example of the Royal Bank of Scotland. The UK replaced senior management. I would not want to discard this option prematurely, unquote. In spite of the evidence and recommendations from top staff, Secretary Paulson and Chairman Bernanke bailed out the merger of Bank of America and Merrill Lynch without requiring replacement of Bank of America's top management or board of directors or imposing any meaningful new requirements on Bank of America's management. Not every national government, faced with troubled, systematically significant banks, behaved the same way. The UK dismissed top corporate management at Royal Bank of Scotland upon rescuing the company, without impairing the bank's ability to operate. Even in the U.S., General Motors' top executive was pushed aside as a condition of federal support. But in the United States, the management of systemically significant banks such as Bank of America not only kept their jobs, they received billions in taxpayer dollars to help plug the holes in their balance sheets. Secretary Paulson regards the government's intervention in financial markets as successful. Certainly TARP and the Fed's many new lending facilities aid systematically significant banks and have bought time for those banks. But the lasting contribution...
Will the gentleman summarize?
I'll summarize right now. The lasting contribution of this committee's investigation will be exposing Treasury and the Fed's failure to require meaningful accountability from systemically significant banks in exchange for federal bailout. Not a single CEO of a systemically significant bank was removed from his job by government action for a misdeed or mistake, nor has a single CEO of a systemically significant bank fully explained his role in creating the circumstance of the financial crisis. The biggest, most powerful bankers have essentially received a free ride at taxpayers' expense. In conclusion, in choosing to bail out Bank of America without also removing its top management for their failure to do due diligence and for withholding potentially material information from shareholders prior to the merger ratification vote, the government sent a signal to the management of all systemically significant banks that their mistakes and their misdeeds will be treated differently and more gently by regulators than those committed by managers of mid-sized and small-sized banks. Over the coming months and years, it will prove to be a dangerously destabilizing signal that we will deeply regret. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, as a point of order, we, on this side at least, we have not received any of the documents that were displayed. Could we get copies of each of those that were put on the board, please?
We'd be delighted to do so, without objection. I now yield to the gentleman from Ohio again, who is a policy, of course, the ranking member of Domestic Policy Subcommittee, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank you, Chairman Kucinich, Ranking Member Issa, for working with me